Okay, we're going to look at Sen's article, Population, Delusion, and Reality. This week's theme is overpopulation, the problem of overpopulation, and what solutions have been offered by various philosophers and academics working in other fields as well. Now both of these articles are going to could be considered as responses to Hardin's article on the tragedy of the commons. Another article we're going to look at by Gardner is a specific response to it, but you could also take Sen's article as well is going to have a response to it, even if it doesn't explicitly mention Hardin's argument throughout. So just a brief overview. Sen's going to argue that opportunities for education and work for women, specifically opportunities for education and work for women, is the best way to curb excessive population growth. And this is in contrast to the coercive measures that have been suggested, for example, once again, by Hardin. So she's also going to look at, throughout this article, she looks at various kind of, caricatures of the overpopulation problem, worries about it, and she kind of deflates them. Using raw empirical statistical data, which is certainly relevant to the overpopulation problem because it partially is an empirical issue. So, just to recall, the population problem is basically the Earth has a limited amount of resources, and if we have more and more human beings on it, with less and less resources for those human beings, then it's catastrophe, right? And there's obviously a big element of truth to that. The Earth really is limited in resources, and there is a tipping point at which there will be so many people that there aren't enough resources for those people, and then what happens after that, I don't know. But regardless, Sen's going to say that there are two wrong-headed approaches to this overpopulation problem that you often find in the literature: the Alarmist Approach, and then there's also the Complacency Approach. Garrett Hardin would be an alarmist. So we'll start with Sen's issues with the alarmist approach. So she writes, and I quote, "Visions of impending doom have been increasingly aired in recent years, often presenting the population problem as a bomb that has been planted and is about to go off. These catastrophic images have encouraged a tendency to search for emergency solutions that treat the people involved not as reasonable beings, allies facing a common problem, but instead as impulsive and uncontrolled sources of great social harm in need of strong discipline." So, to sum it up, on the alarmist approach, there'll be a population explosion. It'll be like the zombie apocalypse. And the only solution is to treat human beings like cats and dogs that have to be neutered and spayed, which I am all for spaying and neutering dogs and cats. We obviously don't want, feral cats and stray dogs is a problem. It's a problem for them. It sucks to be a homeless dog, and it sucks for everyone living around it. We don't experience this as much in the United States, but in other countries. Maybe some of my students are from other countries where there is more of a stray dog or feral cat population, and you know what it's like. So you can maybe see the good in spaying and neutering cats and dogs, okay? The difference is, though, cats and dogs, we don't treat as rational beings. They have a lot of qualities we admire that are similar to humans. They're certainly emotional beings. But they're not like reflective, full-on rational beings the way humans are, right? And so, they don't themselves sign a form saying it's okay for you to, remove my ability to reproduce. I give you permission. There's informed consent like we do with human beings. So, for example, if you get a vasectomy or hysterectomy, we do that with human beings because we're rational. We can do it voluntarily. And one of the reasons many philosophers think that we can do voluntary actions is because we're rational. Like they go hand in hand. Animals are not like that. So, then here's the problem then. Approaches that want to use these kind of, the alarmist suggestions, where they use these kind of coercive measures, treats human beings like cats and dogs. It doesn't respect the rationality of human beings. Okay. So, but on the other side, there's this complacency approach that Sen's going to draw attention to. she also thinks is going to be deeply problematic. So consider this. It took the world human population millions of years to get to the first billion sometime in the 1800s, okay? A long time. It only took 123 years to get to the second billion. Some fast growth, okay? It only took 33 years after that to get to the third billion. Only 14 years to get to the fourth billion. Only 13 years to get to the fifth billion. And even less for the total human population to equal the crowds at Walmart on Black Friday. So, the complacency approach won't work either. So, she then looks at the issue of immigration and population. So, basically what Sen's going to be doing is looking at, what causes what? Is overpopulation causing all these problems in the world? Or is it caused by various issues? And it's important if you getting the order right, okay? So one thing she's going to start looking at is immigration and population. So one current worry concerns the regional distribution of the increase in world population, about 90% of which is taking place in the developing countries. Continues, beyond concerns about the well-being of these poor countries themselves, a more self-regarding worry causes panic in the richer countries, like the United States of the world, and has much to do with the current anxiety in the West about the world population problem. This is founded on the belief that destitution caused by fast population growth in the third world is responsible for the severe pressures to immigrate to developed countries of Europe and North America. So basically, like, one reason people think there's this mass immigration occurring right now is because there's just so much overpopulation in these third world developing countries. Like, literally, they're just running out of space and resources. And that is why they're immigrating. And that is why those of us in the West, affluent countries that really aren't experiencing an overpopulation problem, want to do something about the overpopulation problem, because they're going to come here. And they're going to take our resources too. Oh no! Continues. The growing demand for immigration to the north, however, from the south is related to the shrinking of the world through revolutions in communications and transport, reduction in economic obstacles to labor movements, despite the increase in political barriers and the growing reach and absorptive power of international capitalism, even as domestic politics in the north has turned more inward-looking and nationalistic. So, overpopulation is not what's causing the immigration then, according to Sen. It's those other factors, basically globalization, okay? So continues to try to explain the increase in immigration pressure by the growth rate of total population in the third world is to close one's eyes to the deep changes that have occurred and are occurring in the world in which we live, and the rapid internationalization of its cultures and economies that accompany these changes. So if you think overpopulation is causing all this immigration, not only is your view utterly too simplistic, but it's false. You're not taking into account all these complexities that are more likely behind this immigration, or what's really driving it, okay? So remember in the preface of this class, talked about how globalization is a major factor right now in international relations, and often it's creating the scenarios that have to give rise to this critical reflection on the moral implications of all this stuff. So this is one more example. Okay, so Sen's going to look at two different approaches then to the problem. One called collaboration, and the other we'll call override. Okay, so collaboration involves voluntary choice. It relies on the rational decisions of men and women based on expanded choices, enhanced security, and it's encouraged by open dialogue and extensive discussions. Who wouldn't like that? It honors humans' rationality. It takes seriously the fact that humans are rational beings, okay? We're not like dogs and cats and squirrels in that regard, all right? Override, on the other hand, uses legal and economic coercion. It's the preferred means of alarmists, And basically, families' personal decisions about family planning are overridden by some agency outside of the family. Oftentimes, it's the government, but sometimes. So, one example Sen gives of non-government, but still coercion. Non-government coercion that is still coercion is healthcare clinics in some developing countries that will not give you treatment unless you get rid of your ability to reproduce after a certain point. So that's a type of coercion, basically. You need healthcare, and you can't get it unless you stop reproducing. Um, so it's a coercion in a certain sense. So not all coercion has to be governmental coercion. Were this an intro to philosophy class, and I was talking about the problem of free will, I talk about two different types of coercion, what I call strong versus weak. Now, the coercion in this sense would be a weak coercion. And to explain what I mean, let me explain what strong coercion is. This is free, by the way. This has nothing to do with global moral issues, but it's philosophy, so you're welcome. If I implanted a chip in your brain and it allowed me to control your movements through like my computer, so I could get you to walk where I want, control you like a remote control car, that would be strong coercion. You have like literally no free agency whatsoever at that point. It'd be like a science fiction scenario. Weak coercion is what Sen's talking about, which is the more politically interesting type of coercion. And it's basically like you have some end, some good that you need, that we would say, yeah, it's a need basically. Like healthcare is something that you need, just like food and water, and shelter. All right, and if you basically say the only way you can get that is to do something else that you wouldn't normally do. So basically, that is weak coercion in that sense, and that is troubling, according to Sen. So that is what Sen is talking about. All right, enough of this stuff on free will. If you're interested in free will, take Intro to Philosophy, or take a class on metaphysics. It's a fascinating topic, a lot of fun. All right, so next we look at the. So remember, Sen's main thesis is that increased development is the best way to deal with the overpopulation problem, because if you give people educational opportunities, they're less likely to want to have many kids. Okay, that's a fact. I mean, I doubt many of you Purdue students want to have 12 kids. Is it a coincidence that you're also college students at a Big Ten university, which makes you very high on the socioeconomic scale? I don't think so. Sen would say proof taken. I'm not saying that there aren't students in my class that may want to have lots of kids. Good for you. I'm not against that. Go for it. I'm just saying that generally, the more educated someone is, the less children they want to have. So, Sen presents a wealth of empirical evidence to basically defend that fact. And this then supports the collaborative approach, which, in fact, does curb population growth. But this leads to a worry. The collaborative approach may work, but it also takes time. However, there may not be enough time, in which case the override approach is in fact what is needed. Okay, well, the rest of the article, Sen kind of punctures that. Basically, how well has the override approach actually worked? And she looks at examples from China and India, which are two countries that have experienced lots of population growth in recent decades. And China, for example, the government has taken active measures, what Sen calls the override approach, to curbing the overpopulation. So Sen's going to look at how successful that is and whether or not that's explained the success in curbing overpopulation is due, in fact, to the override approach, or if it's due instead to what factors in the collaboration approach. And she's going to say, it turns out that the evidence still suggests that it's due to the collaboration approach. Okay. So she continues to look at objections along the way to her thesis. For example, it is sometimes argued that signs of an imminent crisis can be found in the growing impoverishment of the South, with falling income per capita accompanying high population growth. In general, there is little evidence for this. Okay? And here's the argument. Take a look at sub-Saharan Africa, for example. The main roots of Africa's economic decline, according to Sen, aren't population growth. Instead, the explosive population growth is a result of the economic decline, which is caused by political decline. So, the population growth isn't a cause of the economic decline. Instead, it's an effect of economic decline. And now getting the effects and causes right is kind of important. So lightning is the cause of thunder, not vice versa. That's scientifically important to know, all right? You're not going to get struck by thunder and die. You're going to get struck by lightning, all right? Hitting the light switch is the cause of the lights going on, not the light bulbs going on causes the flicking of the light switch, all right? Getting what's the cause and what's the effect right is kind of important in sciences and in life, all right? So it follows just as well with population growth. Is population growth causing economic decline, or is it the effect of economic decline? And Sen's going to argue that ultimately it's the effect of economic and political decline. Now I've got a picture of the United States and a Soviet Union flag. Sen is talking about sub-Saharan Africa, which is experiencing a population growth problem, I suppose. And a lot of Africa's political problems right now can be traced back to the Cold War, where basically various alliances were formed, various governments were funded, various military groups were given weapons, and the United States and Russia were behind. Well, the United States and the Soviet Union were behind a lot of that. The Arab Spring, I mean, you can trace that back. The revolution in Iran, you can kind of trace back to that. Subtly, it's not a direct link always, but you can definitely find the links in the chain, okay? This is recognized by, you history majors and you political scientists probably explain this better than I can, But prior to the end of the Cold War, the world was radically different, but during the Cold War, there's a bipolar model. There's just basically a lot of political events could be traced back to that. So, anyways, but this isn't a political science class. All right, so I'm not going to elaborate more on that. Sen makes the argument in the article, which you should have read. All right, so she writes, the complex political factors underlying the troubles of Africa include, among other things, the subversion of democracy and the rise of combative military rules, often encouraged by the Cold War, with Africa providing client states from Somalia and Ethiopia to Angola and Zaire for the superpowers, particularly from the 1960s onward. The explanation of sub-Saharan Africa's problems then has to be sought in these political troubles, which affect economic stability, agricultural and industrial incentives, public health arrangements, and social services, including family planning and population policy. So, of course, however, there is a need to reduce the rate of population growth in Africa. Sen agrees. But that problem can't be isolated from the other factors which contribute to it, the economic, healthcare, education, and stuff. Simply curbing population growth then would be like putting a Band-Aid on a tumor. It's not going to solve the problem, all right? That's important. Well, here's a different worry. Is population outrunning food production? If we have too many people on the planet, how are we going to feed them? Well, evidence suggests right now that food production's on the rise. You're in Indiana. A lot of you are. You know that. Just get in the car and drive 4 miles from campus in any direction and you're going to come across a cornfield. Which that's not evidence that we have plenty of food, but thanks to different technologies, Purdue's got a big agricultural school, we're gotten good at food production. We're not going to run out of food anytime soon. Usually when people aren't getting the food they need, it's more because of political factors than the fact that there's just not enough food to feed them. So, all right. Well, there's another worry. What about areas of famine then? Again, the problems, I just said this, but I'll say it again. The problems are not due to population growth, but other factors in the economic decline, which Sen addressed earlier. Okay. But what about the price of food? Isn't food production getting more expensive? Once again, no. In fact, just the opposite. Food is cheaper today than ever and getting cheaper. Of course, Sen doesn't address this in her article. A lot of the food that's getting cheaper is really bad for you. Processed foods, stuff that gets heavily subsidized, basically like everything that comes from corn. But I'll give Sen credit because, you can pretty much have rice anywhere, and rice can be very good for you. There's a lot of stuff that can be good for you. But the point is that food isn't getting, it's thanks to technologies, it's just getting easier and easier and cheaper to make. So, all right. Well, this leads to another topic. This leads to the issue of women's deprivation in power. So, women in many, I'm quoting Sen again, women in many third world countries are deprived by high birth frequency of the freedom to do other things in life, not to mention the medical dangers of repeated pregnancy and high maternal mortality, which are both characteristic of many developing countries. It is thus not surprising that reductions in birth rates have typically been associated with improvement of women's status and their ability to make their voices heard, often the result of expanded opportunities for schooling and political activity. Okay, so it's not Harden acts as if like women just want to have lots of kids, and basically the point is it's not necessarily true. That's not necessarily the case. In fact, according to Sen, it can be fairly harmful. So, going back then to the issue of should we develop or should we just use coercion? So, if we're going to educate all these women, where are we going to get the money for it? How are you going to get the money for better education, healthcare, etc.? It'd be nice in this idealistic world if we could do that, but who's going to pay for it and how are you going to pay for it, Sen? Do you understand finance? I could hear the objection going, well, Sen's got a point here. Education and health services and many other types of improving life are typically labor intensive, and thus they'd be inexpensive in poor countries because of, well, low wages. You don't have to pay people as much to teach or do healthcare as you would here. So while they have less money to spend, they also need less money to provide those services. And that's true. To be a teacher in a developing country, especially in a developing part of a developing country, it does not cost as much to pay them as it does to pay someone here. Now, that's not the same thing as saying that they were just stiffing them, because that little bit of money has a lot more purchasing power in developing countries as well, and that's what's important. You may make a lot less, but you could still have you could have an equivalent purchasing power, which is a distinction that economists draw, and I think Sen's relying on right now in terms of labor costs. So we're not stiffing them either. Okay. Finally, Sen looks at China's population problem as kind of a case study. Students from China, this would be your chance to speak up on the forums. I'd be interested to hear what you have to say about this and what you think about Sen's claims and arguments. So, Sen looks at China's population policy, which would be coercive. It'd be the override policy. And she is critical of it for several reasons. First, if freedom is valued at all, Sen claims, then the lack of freedom associated with this approach must be seen as a social loss in itself. All right? So the evidence is that freedom is valued. For example, the elected government in India attempted a similar approach to overpopulation as China did in the 1970s. But the politicians who favored that policy were defeated in the next election. Second, family planning experts in India have further observed how the briefly applied programs of compulsory sterilization tended to discredit voluntary birth control programs generally, since people became deeply suspicious of the entire movement to control fertility. Alright, another problem she has with it is that coercion is effective only by making people do things they would not freely do. But the social consequences of such coercion can often be appalling. For example, the demands of a one-child family can lead to neglect or worse of the second child. And cultures with strong preferences for male children can lead to the neglect of females. Third, it isn't clear how much additional reduction has actually been achieved through the coercive measures, as opposed to educational and career opportunities, which is a point I made earlier. Okay, well, that's my thoughts on the Sen.